Okay, hey everybody, Dan Fitzpatrick here. As you can see, stock market mentor. I just finished a tutorial for our members that I don't know. I think it went over an hour, about an hour and a half even. If you're a member, you may want to check that out because I went into some fundamental analysis, which typically I don't go into, and most people don't know much about. So I went into margins and up down volume and a lot of different things. So definitely check that out. By the way, if you're not a member, for $7 you can be for 2 weeks. So maybe you do that. So I want to talk about SanDisk here, and I've talked about this a lot lately. I did cover it in some pretty good detail in this tutorial. I will tell you this. I mentioned this to our members, so you know. I'm actually writing a book on like this is all structure, the hidden backbone of AI. And it's going to be a pretty thick, dense book, but it's about investing. I'm not morphing over to the engineer side of things, but I really feel like I really feel strongly that the storage and memory space stuff like SanDisk and Western Digital and Micron, Seagate, a few others. Those are kind of the big ones, though. And this one's, of course, SanDisk. I really feel like they're actually just kind of getting started. It sure as hell doesn't look that way, does it? It definitely doesn't. Looks like these things have been off to the races and the easy money's been made and all that. And I don't think so. I think that I think there's a lot more money to be made, just not tomorrow. Well, because tomorrow's Saturday, but you can trade around these like here. You know, I bought some of this today. When it gets up to 220, I'll probably let a little bit go as a short term, just as a short term trade, but I don't plan on selling all of this for a long time. Same thing with SanDisk. When it gets up to 400, and it will, I'll probably let a little bit go. And you could say, wow, you know, you can't buy this. Well, I won't buy it at 1,000, but I'll probably sell it at 1,000. Probably not this year, but my bet is next year. Prove me wrong. So what I wanted to just talk about in this free video here is that this looks like SanDisk looks like it's too high to buy, but I've kind of shown you the big picture here. Like I don't look at 377.41. Oh, that's the top. That's not the way. It's not a good way to trade. The trend here is our friend, but it's getting a little bit saucy. It's getting a little volatile. And so we have to be mindful of this volatility. And are you willing to ride a pullback down 15%? Are you willing to ride a pullback down like to here, maybe even to 250, but more like, are you willing to ride one down? This is like 30%. And all this would do, like if this stock fell down to this line here, okay, that's almost 30%. Now, if it did that, there would actually be nothing wrong with this trend. Yes, it got volatile, but all this stock did, like let's say it does pull back that far, all it's done is retraced this volatility squeeze, this first phase pop. The second phase of a squeeze is the pullback to test the breakout. And that breakout happened like right around here. Now, what John Bollinger says is on this type of a pullback, what's really important is that the stock not fall clear through this middle Bollinger Band. Or another way you can look at it is, and I'm making this freaking impossible for you. Another way you can look at it is not the middle Bollinger Band, but like if this was the trading range here, it just can't fall through the middle. It can't fall through the middle of this trading range that before you have to say, okay, well, something's wrong with this. Okay, well, let's say that's 230. All right, so That's a 40% pullback. I don't know about you, but I ain't riding anything down 40%. And so what you have to do is you just have to decide how you're going to trade this and what your level of commitment is. For me, as a trade, there's no way I'd ride it down 40%. Frankly, on a shorter term trade, I guess you could say, okay, well, I'd buy it here and then I'd keep my stop a little bit below this today's intraday low. That's about 12% or so. You could do that, but you have to decide, pick your poison. What's my daily chart? I see all this volatility. This weekly chart, I see a really, really strong uptrend. Look at this price here. This is institutional massive buying. Highest volume week in this stock's history here, at least this time around. So you just kind of have to decide how you're going to trade this, but you definitely want to own it. Same thing with WDC. I picked up some today, not as a trade, but as a longer term retirement account that I'm really trying not to trade, but rather just get some positions in some stocks like this and just let them go. So I bought this phase one breakout, phase two pullback. Now it's looking, I've already drawn this line. Now it's looking like we're going to go into phase three. So these are two stocks I think that could really, really work for you. And you know what? I'm just going to, I'll just leave that there. Check out my website, Stock Market Mentor. If you're not a member, I invite you to join. I'm doing a lot of work along with Scott, but we're really, really ramping up a lot of things. And I'm going to be, in fact, I already have my pre-launch group that's been helping me with my book that I'll release. I'd kind of hoped to release it already, but then vacation got in the way. But you can check that out pretty soon. 7 deadly mistakes, 7 deadly trading mistakes, and how to fix them. I can't help you with the rest of your life. So anyway, that's all I got. I'll see you guys Monday.